All right. So right now I'm going to show you how to clean wet seeds. And when I say wet seeds, I mean seeds that ripen in a fruit like a tomato or stone fruits like these choke cherries. And basically the process is the same for any kind of plant that makes a seed that has any, or a fruit that has any kind of juice. And you can see like that's juicy. It's not like a dry pod. And we'll talk about cleaning dry seeds in a separate video. So the first step is trying to get rid of as much of the non-seed material as possible. I'll use this tomato as a little demonstration. And so when you open up a tomato, you can see there's a lot of flesh, and then you've got all the seeds, and they're contained in these little gel sacs. See how they're like, there's some gunk around there. So we want to try and get out as much, we want to get out all the seeds with as little of the everything else as possible. And for a tomato, you can still eat all the rest, but I'm just going to use a spoon and just kind of scrape all those seeds. And the rest of the tomato is still perfectly good. And all the seeds and the juice and the gel goes into a jar or whatever container is handy. And I like to add just a little bit of water. Doesn't need to be a ton, just enough to make sure everything stays in like a liquid form. And then the next stage is to ferment that. And I like to cover it to keep flies out, but you don't want to use a regular lid that's screwed on all the way, because as it's fermenting, it will produce some gas, and it could kind of blow up if it was totally sealed up, and that's kind of a bummer. It will also smell bad, especially in the case of something like a cucumber. Those fermenting seeds smell really gross, so if you can put it, you know, not directly in your kitchen, your family or housemates would probably appreciate that. But you also don't want it to freeze if you're doing this like really late in the fall. So a warm spot is good, and it usually only takes a couple days to ferment if it's nice and warm out. And with something like a tomato that has that gel sac around the seed, you know they're done fermenting when the gel has broken down, and the seeds will just kind of clump together. Also, you can see some of the seeds are like kind of floating, and that's because they're sitting on that gel. When they're fully fermented, all the seeds should basically sink to the bottom. This jar has some schizandra seeds that are all done fermenting, basically. And you can see that up here is all the like pulp of the berries, and then down at the bottom is all the seeds. And the way to separate them kind of relies on the difference in density between the seeds and that pulp. And basically all you have to do is add water. Until you've got a very watery slurry. And I'm just gonna grab a bucket to dump this into. So now you can see there's lots of skins of berries floating up at the top. There's a few seeds in there too. Those floaty seeds are probably dead, so we're not going to worry about trying to hang on to those. And now all we have to do is just pour off all that slurry until we start to see seeds getting near the edge. And then fill it up with water again. Give the seeds a second to soak to or sink to the bottom. Pour it off again. And every time you do this, it gets a little bit easier because there's less chunks of whatever that are stopping the seeds from sinking right to the bottom. So now the seeds are already like laying right on the bottom, and we will pour off all the pulp. And at some point, you'll have just a few little bits left, which can be worth hand picking out. So now I'll use a sieve. I've got mostly clean seeds there. I'm just gonna hand pick out these berry remnants. And you can see some black stuff in here too. That's like bits of mulch and dirt. And that's because a lot of these berries, when I started, I was picking them up off the ground. They're ones that like birds knocked off the vine. And so I wasn't gonna bother, trying to make those into food or medicine, but they're still perfectly good for collecting seeds. So now I've got all the big chunks. I did squish at least one chunk of pulp in there, so I'm gonna bring most of these back to the jar. Just for one more final rinse. This is where a canning funnel can be very helpful. I didn't happen to bring mine out with me. Alright, so one more rinse. You can see there's very little left in there. I'm going to kind of swirl it around to try and kick up whatever little bits of pulp are left. Pour that junk off. And clean seeds. Now, depending on what species of seed, these might be ready to store. For Schizandra, I do not recommend drying Schizandra seed. So these are ready to store. I'm just gonna make sure that there's, whatever liquid water can drain off of them is drained off, because we don't want them sitting in a puddle, but we also don't want them to completely dry. Once these tomato seeds are done, the wash process is exactly the same, but tomato seeds do store best as a dry seed. So those would be left either in a sieve like this, or on a piece of newspaper or whatever, left out to completely air dry before being put into any sort of sealed storage. And you can hear more about the intricacies of storing seeds in the podcast that goes along with this video.